In this lecture, I want to wrap up what we've been talking about with experimental, natural experimental, and quasi-experimental designs and compare the three different types of designs with each other. So we have this table here comparing randomized controlled experiments, RCEs, natural experiments, and quasi-experiments. And then let's look at three different questions and address them for each of the three different types of experimental designs. So first, whether the researcher assigns subjects into treatment and control. Second, whether assignment into treatment and control is really random. And then third, whether the researcher designs and administers the treatment, him or herself. So let's look at that first question, whether the researcher assigns the subjects into treatment and control. Well, this is something that happens with a randomized control experiment. They collect the subjects, or they recruit their subjects, and then they decide who gets the treatment, who gets the control, right? So they're able to say, yes, these groups are truly equivalent. We have randomly divided them into treatment and control. With a natural experiment, we will say that there is an element of randomness of who goes into treatment and control, but the researcher isn't the one that does it. By the nature of the name, we see that it is nature itself that assigns into treatment and control. And with quasi-experiments, the researcher definitely does not assign into treatment and control. Second, can we consider assignment into treatment and control to be random? Even if the researcher isn't in charge of it, can we say that the treatment and control groups are really equivalent on everything except for the treatment? And again, with the RCE, yes, that's part of the definition of an RCE. It's even, in fact, in the name that it's a controlled experiment. Natural experiment, while the researcher wasn't as able to assign into treatment and control, the defining feature is that there is random assignment in some way, right? And with a quasi-experiment, the researcher isn't in charge of treatment and control, and assignment and treatment control can't really be said to be random at all. And then finally, does the researcher design and administer the treatment? And with the RCE, yes, the researcher is in charge of everything along the way. Natural experiment, no. They're taking advantage of some sort of event of nature that divides the potential subjects into two different groups. And so the researcher isn't in charge of that. Sometimes a researcher is able to design and administer treatment in the quasi-experiment. So sometimes they're not, as we saw with the Connecticut crackdown example. It's not as if the researchers were deciding to have crackdown on the Connecticut side of the border. But other times you can have a semi-experimental group where, say, you have in a classroom, you have two classes and the researcher uses one pedagogical technique with one class and uses a different pedagogical technique in the other class to see the effect of that innovative pedagogy. So the researcher isn't deciding who goes into which classroom, and it's not necessarily random. You may have an early class, and sort of certain types of students will assign themselves into that class. But you are able to compare the two groups in some ways. You're able to say, well, they are hopefully somewhat similar, and we're able to control this treatment. So for quasi-experiments, it depends. So the key here is that these are the three questions that we should be asking about our experimental or semi-experimental designs. The further away you get from these yes answers, the more potential problems with internal validity are emerging from them.